Greetings, everyone. This is Richard Solomon and Paul Solomon taking care of business. Today's guest is one of our favorite guests, Joanna Colangelo from the Endless Tour Project. As you may recall, we interviewed her before her 2014 journey across America, retracing the Grateful Dead's last tour in 1995, city by city and venue by venue. She joins us again, and we're so happy to have her. So welcome back, and thank you for spending some time with us.
Well, thanks for having me. Hey, guys.
So we got to ask you, you did the tour, and what was it like? What was surprising and intriguing? I mean, I know that's like a loaded question, but it must have been amazing.
It was. It was great. It was. Well, there were definitely some changes and some surprises along the way, and but I think that's, I was expecting that. I was hoping for that, actually, in the true spirit of the Grateful Dead. I kind of went into it thinking I'm going to be open to everything and anything that may come along. So that, that includes, changing routes, changing directions, kind of blowing wherever the wind was going to blow that day, and being very, very open to improvisation. And so I had a few things I wanted to really stick to, my safety being one of them. But other than that, I was pretty much open to seeing how things would evolve. And they definitely did. The biggest piece of it was that I wound up not sticking, actually, to the 95 dates and venues, those original dates and those original venues. And a lot of that was to allow for extended time in different cities, was to allow for detours into other states and other cities where there were deadheads who had stories to share. And so that was the thing of most importance for me, was being able to capture all of those stories and be open to kind of getting them and not necessarily following the strict route from almost 20 years ago. So that was the biggest change. But as for surprises, what was surprising was actually that the Deadhead community is not surprising. It is exactly what, you would hope and wish it still is, which is a very, very vibrant, communal, alive, colorful, passionate, piece of American culture. It is as much intact today, I would say, as it was 20 years ago.
What did you learn about the United States of America going cross country? And what did you learn? And what did you learn about the weather? I saw some information that would have been Weather Channel worthy, like when nature strikes back.
Oh goodness, the weather. I have to say, and that was the irony on all of this is that I did wind up changing the route a little bit from those original dates because of the weather, because it was just me solo in a car, and that goes back to safety. And I thought, all right, let me try to follow the weather patterns here a little bit and stay where there's good weather. And for the most part I did, but wow, there will be some stories of just missing an avalanche up in Snoqualmie Pass in Washington, driving through dust storms in Oklahoma and New Mexico with, literally my phone like beeping, saying, the message coming up saying, if you're on a highway right now, get off.
Wow.
Under any circumstances, do not drive. And I'm like, looking around 100 miles from nowhere thinking, well, I guess I'm going to have to ride this one through, So, yeah, tornadoes, getting up, waking up with tornado warnings, it almost got comical. An earthquake in Los Angeles, it by the end was just funny. I was like, okay, bring on the tidal wave in New York,
Now, what kind of gear did you have with you? Did you have like GPS? Did you have two different cell phones, like one as a backup? Batteries, flashlights, rain gear, boots, or did you really go, or did you really rough it?
I had one cell phone, but at any given time, 3 different people always knew where I was. So that was helpful. And I would, if I was staying with a stranger, that is someone who I had never met before. So there were definitely people who I met along the road and decided that it'd be a good idea to stay with them. And in those cases, I always let people know before I went to sleep where I was, what the address was, and then I let them know as soon as I woke up. So I figured, in worst case scenario, there'd only be like an 8-hour lapse of someone not knowing where I was. As for gear, I had sort of the basic survival tools in the car. A first aid kit, candles, waterproof matches, a tent. I had carried a bunch of hunting knives with me, lighters, beef jerky, Cliff Bars, and a couple of gallons of water, just in case I ever got stuck anywhere. But that was it. And my biggest fear, honestly, while I was driving, it was really never for my safety. It was just that I was going to get like a flat tire in the middle of absolutely nowhere, and was just going to have to. And I can change a flat tire, but that was, strangely enough, that was like the haunting fear throughout the journey.
Were there places where there was just absolutely no cell phone reception?
Yeah.
And
yeah.
That must have been a little freaky, because in many ways our cell phone is our link to the world in many ways. I guess like the Borg, that's how you hook into the collective,
Yeah, it was. It was the first time, I think, was a little unsettling. But then it got really almost relaxing and kind of liberating, because there's so few places anymore where you can do that in this country. I mean, I've traveled abroad and you have those patches, but in the United States, it's pretty hard to really go off the grid. And I was looking forward to doing that, and I was very, very happy that I was able to from time to time. It was definitely one of the things I was hoping to be able to do, and it's scary, but it's so refreshing. You really get a sense of how huge the country is, and how small we are in it. And a lot of times when I didn't have cell phone reception, it was when I was like far out in the wilderness, and if you kind of close your eyes, or if you squint your eyes a little bit, you can get a sense of what the country was like, 200 years ago. And it's such a rare gift. And it was a great joy to be able to experience that in 2014.
How many miles did you put on the car, and how many how many oil changes did you go through?
Oh, I'm gonna have a panic attack just thinking about it. I had 2 oil changes, so that would be at least 20,000 miles, right?
More like 6 to 10. Oh, your poor car.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the older the car, the more frequent you're supposed to do the oil change.
Oh, well, I think my route was, it started in New Mexico, went up to Utah, and then up to Oregon, Washington, and then down the West Coast. And then I kind of looped across the Midwest to Oklahoma, Kansas, Missouri, down the south into Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, and then up the eastern seaboard, up to New York, and then across Pennsylvania, Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana, Illinois, Minnesota, South Dakota, and then like Wyoming, Colorado, back to Utah. So it was a chunk of the country, but I think I like to think I was responsible with the mileage as best as I could be.
Did you use apps or tools or GPS to track, where you were and where services and support and whatever, food, restaurants, retail stores?
Retail. As long as I was going through a major city at some point, I could always stock up on what I needed. and there are, in most of the places I was going to cut through a major city within sort of an 8-hour span somewhere along the way. So I was never really too concerned that I was going to be caught short on anything. As for getting around, I used GPS, although a lot of the places I wound up going, whether it was for interviews for the Endless Tour project or just because I thought it would be a fun shortcut, definitely went off GPS. So in those cases, it was the good old-fashioned map. Some people would write out a map or draw me a map to their house. So I still have those in a notebook somewhere. But I will say I actually I had a few backup GPSs because I was going in some pretty remote areas, and I thought, all right, if I get lost, even with a map, it's going to be hard to get out of this. But I resorted to really like good old fashioned navigation. If I wasn't sure which way to go, I'd look at the sun, and if it was forenoon or afternoon, I knew which way to turn. It was very, I tried to keep it as basic as I could, but certainly the GPS was helpful.
Did you ever put your ear to the ground to see if the train was coming?
Hold on to the track, feel the vibrations. No.
Now, what kind of gear do you have to record all of the data? Audio, video, computers, email. What did you use as your basic, journalism gear?
Yeah, it was definitely a modern day mobile office. So a laptop with Wi-Fi whenever I could pick it up. My iPhone, which I have to say I'm no spokesperson for Apple products, but talk about a lifesaver. Talk about something you can do everything on. I mean, it was my telephone, it was my email, it was my scanning. You just get a scanning app and you scan things and email them off. It was incredible. And then I also had with me an HD film camera, so I filmed almost all of my interviews. I'd say about 90% of them. And then as often as I could, I would sort of hold the camera up and just film if I was driving, or sometimes turn it back on me.
So this is like Survivor Man, like on the...
Right. Watching some of the footage, you'll get a little seasick. And I had a still camera that I didn't use too often. And I had a digital audio recorder that I would use if folks weren't comfortable with video, or if the video just wasn't right at that time. And that was it, and a whole lot of hard drives.
Wow, and did you have like memory sticks and rechargers and extra batteries? And
I did. I had some extra batteries. I had some wires for the film camera, so so people were mic'd. And I had double hard drives for everything that I was recording, so everything got backed up twice.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now,
and that was bigger.
What was it like? In a way, you lived in your car. Mm-hmm. As much as you may have been land-based, you really lived in the car. So as you were driving, was it more cell phone calls? Was it more listening to music? Was it replaying interviews? How did you spend the time driving around, or did you listen to the navigation voice? Turn left in 5 miles.
I did name my navigation. So my navigation voice and I are on a first name basis. And
did you get along?
No, we would get into fights every now and again, but I listen to music a lot of the time, most of the time, and I listen to a lot of the Grateful Dead channel or Grateful Dead on my iPod, which I'm surprised by. I know that the project was about the Grateful Dead, but I didn't think I was actually going to listen to them as much as I did. But I just couldn't. I think it was twofold. I think part of it was that I was so entrenched in the world while I was doing this, and the other part is just simply that the Grateful Dead is some of the best road music you could possibly ever want to hear as you're driving across the country. So it just made a lot of sense. But phone calls to friends and family were key. I mean, it kept me sane, kept me rooted in the rest of the world that was going on, because you could really get lost in your own in your own head, but also just in your own little traveling. You could kind of lose sense of time and space and lose sense of what day it is and all that stuff. So I had a lot of good friends and very close family who were very kind to spend an hour straight on the phone with me and keep me company when I needed it.
Well, let me put it this way. That was the fastest first segment of radio ever. We'll be right back. Hanging. We're talking with Joanna Colangelo of the Endless Tour Project, endlesstourproject.com. Keep it right here. Welcome back. Richard Solomon, Paul Solomon, taking care of business with our guest, Joanna Colangelo from the Endless Tour Project, recounting her incredible journey across America following the 1995 tour, sort of city by city and sort of venue by venue. It started out one way, but that's the way these things are. So what famous folk did you meet along the way? Because I saw some very interesting people on your website. For example, you got to meet Wavy Gravy.
I did.
Now, what was that like, and how did that come about?
That was a very cool interview, and totally unexpected. So I was in Eugene, Oregon, and I was talking to some folks. That's kind of extended Grateful Dead family land up there, and as most things happened on this project, on this journey, a lot of it was just total almost synchronicity or coincidence or just the web that is the Grateful Dead world. And so I was in Eugene, and someone said to me, where are you going next? And I said, I'm going to Northern California and then down to the Bay. And they said, is there anyone you want to meet in the Bay Area who you haven't been able to connect with? And I just sort of said, I'd love to sit down with Wavy Gravy at some point, because I wanted to, the main focus of the project was actually not to talk to members of the Grateful Dead or people sort of famously connected to the Dead, but I had kind of the biker presence out east, and I really wanted to get the opposite of that on the West Coast, which was kind of your pranksters and your Wavy Gravy scene. And so I just mentioned that. And as things have a way of happening with the Grateful Dead, the person I mentioned it to was like, I got you covered. Don't worry about that. Give me a day. And we'll get you in to see Wavy Gravy. And that was it. It was just a very, and by the time I got down to Berkeley, I wasn't intending to interview him actually for the project. I just sort of wanted to chat with him and kind of hear some of his stories. And when I got to his place, the woman who had taken me there said, grab your camera. He'll go on film. He's comfortable with all of that. So I literally just set the camera up. I think I might have asked one question, and that's all it took. And he just went rolling. And he, I didn't even need to ask a follow-up question. It was he said everything I could have wanted to hear, and that was that. Couldn't have been more gracious, more funny, and more welcoming. It was great.
Who else along the way was surprisingly interesting and or of sort of? I'll ask about all kinds of people, but of the more well-known people, the more of the people who are kind of like a household name, like a Wavy Gravy, for example?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
Well, I'm to edit that part out.
All right. Who were people of note who had poignant stories or great recollections or kind of wowed you a little bit?
Well, I'll say that the most poignant stories that I heard over and over again were people talking about seeing the Grateful Dead. They were kind of the older Deadheads a little bit. I think I met up maybe with kind of three generations of Deadheads. The first generation, more of kind of the originals, and then that second generation, which was maybe people in their college years or their 20s in the 80s, and then people like me who were maybe the third generation who were in their who were much younger, say in the 90s, when they went to see the Dead. And the more poignant tales were some of the older folks getting really choked up. I mean, I would say about 70% of the people I interviewed started to cry during their interviews. And not because Jerry Garcia had died or, and that may have been part of it, but that wasn't really what was so moving. But it was people talking about their youth, and like this part of their life that is very cherished and kind of in the past now, and people taking their kids to see the Dead or people going with their parents to see the Dead and it's kind of gone. And I think for a lot of people, they hadn't talked about that in a very long time, and it took them by surprise, getting pretty emotional. So that broadly was the more surprising and very, very touching moment.
How much did people talk about taping, vinyl records, record stores, album art, things like that? Well, the album art was big. A lot of people. I tried to sit down with folks from every kind of subgenre of the Deadhead world. So, sat down with some twirlers and dancers and some tapers who are, very serious tapers. Some of the earlier tapers. And then I would talk with other people who were kind of those Deadheads who like wouldn't move. They would just sit there in silence and just want to listen to the music and, like front row every time right in front of Jerry. That's where they were going to be. So it was interesting to see how, and people still very, very strongly identify with these subgroups within the Deadhead community. And I would say tapers are still some of your like prouder, very dedicated, very meticulous Deadheads. And so I talked with them, and I have to say, I mean, their knowledge of the technology and back then, and then the changes of technology even up to today, is mind blowing. I mean, I'm not a huge tech person, so I wasn't even following, a whole lot of what they were saying in terms of the contemporary technology, but they're still very patched into the scene, and what's become of it, and very, very, just very smart, very advanced people, I would say. What did people talk about obtaining tickets, getting the Miracle or things like Dupree's Diamond News or did anyone, I'm sure you saw every T-shirt from almost every tour as well. Yeah.
Again, there's some very conflicting opinions out there about the tickets. So met a lot of people who would go and try to get their Miracle tickets, and some of whom got them. Met people who would always go with the Miracle ticket, and then they would kind of explain how they would miracle it out and what they were looking for in that chosen person. And then I met people who were really adamant about no one going to see the Dead without a ticket, and how that was kind of the beginning of the end, were people just showing up without tickets and what that meant. And they felt very strongly that was really the beginning of what would become kind of that violent parking lot demise and all of that. So yes, it was, I was surprised, I think, a little bit at the levels of intensity that people still, it's almost 20 years later, but people still talking about kind of those sub-societal breakdowns in the Grateful Dead community. People, again, they feel strongly. And the tickets, that was a hot topic, particularly when we were talking about the 95 tour, because you had the gate crashers in Deer Creek in Indianapolis, and you had the same thing, I think, up in Vermont. So that was a quick way to get people really angry when I was interviewing them, was to bring up those shows.
What did people talk about as far as sort of the length of shows or particular songs?
The song broadly, the songs that kept coming up over and over and over again, almost every interview, verbatim, was Garcia Hunter ballads. That was the line. Everyone was like, "Oh, well, those Garcia Hunter ballads." Whenever I talk about kind of moving moments at shows, and then the song that came up over and over was Stella Blue.
Yeah, I saw that I saw that on your website, and that was intriguing because, I mean, I like the song, but if you ask me to think of what song resonates with the Grateful Dead, you know, I guess that's really more of a Jerry-specific song, whereas I think of songs like Passenger or Terrapin Station or I Know You Rider, kind of is more of like, you know, band-centric, I guess.
Yeah, yep. I thought it started. I think I heard about Stella Blue. I mean, I've certainly always known about the song, but in terms of this context, a couple of people brought it up at the beginning of my travels, and then it just kept happening. So much so that I started to make note of how many people were talking about Stella Blue, and as I was, kind of referring to earlier with people getting pretty emotional when they were talking, Stella Blue, people talking about Stella Blue was hard for them to get through without crying. And that was, I think hearing them discuss it and going back in that memory, it typically was always a later in years Jerry Garcia Stella Blue, so it wasn't really people talking about like the late 70s Stella Blue. It was more of the 1994, 95, and them just talking about this sort of lone blue light on Jerry Garcia, looking, pretty old and tired. And I think just the emotion of that song and what the song kind of means lyrically, that in retrospect, and maybe it happened in the moment, but at least in retrospect for these people talking about it, that really stood out as a lasting memory of Jerry Garcia in particular. I think the Grateful Dead, there are some broader memories, but for particular Jerry Garcia memory, I think that blue light on that gray hair or that white hair at the time, just belting out this song that'll rip your heart out. And dust off those rusty strings just one more time. That image stayed with people very strongly.
How much did people talk about Bob Dylan or people that they shared the stage with? Like I remember seeing Traffic with. I think it was at the Meadowlands, and I remember seeing Traffic with the Grateful Dead and seeing all of them sing Dear Mr. Fantasy. I thought that was really cool. And then I saw Bob Dylan. I don't know if it was at the Garden or not, but I think it was the Garden it was Bob Dylan and the Dead. And it was after the Dylan and the Dead album, I believe. And it was sort of interesting because the Dead do a lot of Dylan covers, and to see them actually together I thought was really neat. But from all of the different people who you spoke to, did you get a sense of sort of the collaborative efforts with other well-known acts, musicians, artists, bands, and did anybody talk about that?
That's a good question. I don't know how often that came up. I think that might have come up more if I had talked to the band or people in the band operation. The fans mostly talked more about how listening to the Grateful Dead turned them on to other music that they may not have been as familiar with. Whether it was, a little bit more in the bluegrass scene or more in the jazz world, or even some of their classic rock, or rock and roll, whatever, contemporaries. And, a couple of people remarked on that, the Grateful Dead was the best Bob Dylan cover band, there ever was. And so kind of coming to some more rare Dylan tunes through the Grateful Dead. But I think that was the extent of it for that. It was just a little bit more about opening up their eyes to different genres of music, because the Dead was such a melting pot of, if you like birdsong, you're probably going to like some Dave Brubeck tunes. It was that kind of thing.
How much did people talk about songs that sort of were played a lot and then sort of disappeared, like Dark Star or or Dark Star, has versions that go from like, I guess, 12 minutes to 43 minutes.
Right. Right. Well, yeah. I mean, a lot of people had sort of the mythical concert that they wish they had been to, or that mythical concert experience. But a very fun interview I had was a guy in upstate New York, or just north of the city in New York, and he was actually at those Hampton shows in '89 when the Dead broke out Dark Star again, and Help on the Way, Slipknot, Franklin's Tower, Addicts in My Life. When they brought out all these tunes that hadn't been played in a long time, and he said it was the most magical music moment he could have ever imagined, beyond what he could have imagined. And I think, having not been there, of course, but listening to what he said and then going and sort of finding those files on YouTube, I have to think that 90% of it was the music and being able to experience that, but the other 10% was just being in this community of Deadheads. And everyone kind of knowing what was going, when you heard those first few notes of Dark Star, and that they hadn't played it in years, and everyone kind of like just that energy that must have resonated through however many, 15,000 people, however many people were there, must have just been electrifying. I mean, I think it's got to do something to your pulse at that time. So
I was actually at one show, and I can't remember. I think it was in the Oakland Coliseum. And I think they played Dark Star, and people like fainted. It was sort of like, get the defibrillator paddles. They're playing Dark Star. It's like, and this was before cell phones, because could you imagine the amount of cell phone pictures and people like trying to record the song, or Twitter?
Yeah. Oh, it would have taken Twitter down. You would have had Dark Star trending,
It's like, OMG, DS,
right.
UFB.
Exactly. So, I can't imagine. # Dark Star.
This is something I always wanted to know, and I don't know if you found this out on your travels, and maybe if not, I'll ask that you maybe find this out for us. Did anyone ever figure out how the Dead came up with what they were going to play on any particular day?
I have no idea.
Because, it's funny. I recently saw Dark Star Orchestra at the Westbury Music Fair, and saw Jeff Madsen, and they were great. And what was interesting, they said, and that was, Grateful Dead, December 11th, 1969. And it was, an unbelievable show. And you say to yourself, how did they pick what they were going to play? Because I saw them like several nights in a row at the Garden, and it was all different. And you wondered, why did they pick this stuff for this day and that stuff for that day? Did anyone ever talk about how they came up with that?
No, I didn't get that out of anyone, and I haven't the slightest idea. I mean, other than hearing a few interviews here and there of Jerry Garcia talking about basically that they didn't know. I don't know. It seems odd that they wouldn't have even like a blueprint of a set list, but I don't. It appears that really they didn't. And sometimes when you hear them when they're going into like extended jams, you can hear little bits of other songs that they're kind of maybe going to play, and then they don't. Then they go do something else. So I do think it's very well evidenced that they didn't have a set list, because you could almost hear them working it out as they're doing it.
Well, one thing I could say from my own personal observations is I never saw on the carpet the white piece of paper with the song list. Because no matter what kind of binoculars you had, or you never saw that, where you go to a concert and either near the drummer on the see-through plastic they have it written, or on the white sheets by the wah-wah pedals you'll see the song list. You never saw that. So
nope.
So this is a very fast interview. So when we come back, I want to ask you about the set lists and the voracious notes that people took to record what the set list was and how that was databased. So this is Richard Solomon, Paul Solomon, with Joanna Colangelo, the Endless Tour Project, endlesstourproject.com. We'll be right back. Don't go away because it's a long, strange trip. We'll be right back. You're rocking with Rich Solomon, Paul Solomon, and Joanna Colangelo. Joanna Colangelo is the Endless Tour Project, endlesstourproject.com, and we are talking to her about her 2014 adventure, and it really was an adventure. Windswept, tornadoes, mudslides, rattlesnakes, vermin, all kinds of stuff on retracing essentially the Grateful Dead's 1995 tour and talking to people in the cities and venues, more or less, and really just delving into the whole Grateful Dead experience, armed with digital equipment to take it all in and meeting all kinds of really cool folk along the way. So before the break, we were asking the question about, I remember seeing at concerts, there would be people with little flip spiral notebooks, either the small kind that were like for the pocket or just little piece of paper, and you saw them voraciously writing the set list. Somehow, all of that data merged. You remember, this is all analog. All that data merged into some kind of database where people actually knew from the beginning how many times they played, Lady with a Fan, Bird, and they even knew like statistics, like how many times they went from Another Saturday Night, or how many times they played Another Saturday Night on Saturday night. Or they would go into drum space with this percentage of times, and they would come out of drum space with I Know You Rider or something like that. Did you talk to anybody about the set list as far as recording them for later reference?
Well, yes, not in super great detail, but I will say that this is one of the funniest and most accurate little side notes that I had heard on the trip. And I was in Seattle, and I was talking to a Deadhead, and I said he was a director of development for a private school, and I said, what's one of the biggest misconceptions you think that's out there about Deadheads? And he said, oh, it's that myth of Deadheads, that Deadheads are out, doing drugs on a commune somewhere, and that they're just kind of these spacey hippie people. And he's like, that may be true somewhere in some population. He said, but that's certainly not been my experience with Deadheads. And he said, for me, I think in order to be a Deadhead, you have to be at least a little bit OCD. And I started laughing, and I was like, you're absolutely right. And he said, think about it. Think about what Deadheads have done. They have cataloged everything that's ever been recorded about the Grateful Dead, not only in audio, but they've done it in Grateful Dead sort of Bibles, Dead Base. They've published books on it. They've not only organized it, but they've organized it by date. They've organized it, sub-organized it alphabetically. He just went through this whole thing, and he said they created databases before the internet was really the internet. And he said, you've got to be pretty type A to be able to do that. That's one of the great paradoxes of Deadheads. Everyone thinks they're these sort of free-living, free-loving people, which we are, but we're also pretty intense about certain details. And that's it. I mean, and I think that came up over and over again. I would meet people, and they'd whip out these notebooks with dust on them and pull them out of boxes. And in those boxes was their entire life chronicled of the Grateful Dead, in perfect order, and just notebooks with all the set lists, their ticket stubs, stacks of them framed. It was incredible, the amount of detail and care and precision that was put into preserving their memories of their time with the Dead.
I remember when people were selling lyric books, and this was way before the internet. If I were to ask you, Professor Colangelo, Professor Emeritus of Sociology, what would you say is the unifying theme of all the Deadhead experiences? What makes these people and the music different than other music and music?
That's a great question. And I think I would say it was, well, I could sum it up. I might say a bad word, which you might have to bleep out. But someone said that the thing with the Grateful Dead was that you could be anyone, you could be any kind of person, you could have any kind of interest in the world, and you could come to a Grateful Dead concert and be wholeheartedly accepted and welcomed into this family. The only thing you couldn't be was an asshole. and I think that was kind of, from a cultural standpoint, I think that was very important. And it was a place where people found a sense of home. Even if you had a home, it wasn't always people going in search of home, but it was this sort of place where you could completely be yourself, which I actually think is more probably the theme of the 60s than anything else. It was, the idea that you didn't really have to answer to anyone. You just had to be true to whoever it was that you wanted to be. And I think that was pretty evident in the way that the Grateful Dead played their music and the way that they conducted themselves as a kind of a leaderless group, and the fact that they really were pretty apolitical. They didn't preach a whole lot of anything. They didn't preach drugs. They didn't preach politics. They did what they did and kind of thought that you should be able to do whatever it was that you wanted to do, provided, you weren't hurting people. And I think that was kind of the theme that came through all across this country, and when I was doing this project, and all across the different generations of Deadheads, was just a very welcoming group of people who were very diverse. People from all walks of life, Fortune 500 executives to, organic farmers working for themselves. But the theme was that everyone was doing what they really felt they wanted to do in life, and they were pretty happy and content with it. And I would say almost everyone, believe it or not, and might sound like an exaggeration, but I actually don't think it is. I would say almost every single person credited that to their time with the Grateful Dead.
Did anyone ever comment on the band's lack of talking to the audience? I mean, they never said anything more than, "We'll be back after a short break." and, I mean, they never really, you knew the deal. You knew they'd come in tune, they'd play a long time, there'd be drum space. We'll be right back after a short break. They would play, and then they would just leave.
Yep.
They just leave. And I know I said this on the first show, but I'll never forget. I was at Madison Square Garden with my friend Mary Bigger, and I'm like, "They just leave?" And she's like, "Well, yeah, they expect you to be here tomorrow."
Yeah.
But did it bother anybody? They didn't even say like, "Hey, welcome New Yorker." That was just part of who they were, which was, it's just music. We just tune, we play music, and we leave.
Yeah, I think it's funny because it never came up that it bothered anyone. But I will say that there was, there's this sense among a lot of people who I met that that all of this was bigger than it shows. That there were a lot of people talked about, the Grateful Dead playing, something about some song about the weather, and then all of a sudden that would happen. So they'd be singing about rain, and then boom, it would start to rain. And this came up over and over again. And along those same lines, people often remarked about their moments with members of the Dead when they were playing. So people would lock eyes with Jerry Garcia during a song and swear, that they had this connection through the song. And I don't doubt it, that Jerry was looking at them and smiling, and they smiled up at Jerry. And that was all they needed. That was all the communication they ever needed. And people had similar things with Phil, or, they'd be kind of laughing, with Bobby doing something. And so people actually really, despite the non-talking, felt this very, very deep connection with the band, whether it was through those eye-locking moments, or whether it was through the changing weather, or people had a very deep connection when that band stepped on the stage. I actually don't know that they needed to say anything.
To what extent?
More.
To what extent did people talk about, I guess what you call it, the side projects, the Jerry Garcia band, Rat Dog, Phil Lesh and Friends?
Mm-hmm. People loved seeing Jerry Garcia band, especially in the later years of the Grateful Dead. That was a strong theme through the interviews, was that as the Grateful Dead phenomenon was getting bigger and bigger, the Jerry Garcia band shows felt a bit more intimate. They were smaller venues, and you could kind of just walk up and see Jerry Garcia at the end of them if you really wanted to, just go hang out with him. So that was a pretty big theme. In terms of the kind of newer Dead, or the spin-offs of the Grateful Dead after 1995, that was met with some mixed opinions, and none of them negative. No one's saying that they didn't like them or anything like that, but some people saying that it was a great extension of their time with the Grateful Dead, and other people saying, I don't really have as much interest to go see them. I kind of want my last memories of the Grateful Dead to be as the Grateful Dead, with Jerry Garcia. That's how it needed to end for me, and I'm good with that. I don't really have a whole lot of interest in seeing any solo members right now.
Well, I'll share with you I remember I saw Jerry Garcia on Broadway.
Oh, you did?
Which was very cool. I saw Jerry Garcia at the Warwick Theater in San Francisco, and I thought that was way cool. And I actually saw the Dead, when they were the Dead, when Warren Haynes played with them. I believe that was 2007. Mm-hmm. They played, I believe it was at the Meadowlands, or it was definitely inside his giant stadium. And I remember Warren Haynes was there, and the two drummers, everybody, Kreutzmann Hart was there. I forgot who the other people were that accompanied the band, but it was bittersweet because it was the Dead, but you definitely felt the void. And I even think that Warren Haynes was he had a music stand, and I remember he was looking at a lot of the pages because I remember either hearing or reading that the band's repertoire was so big and diverse, and it's played differently. There are the versions of songs from the 70s as opposed to the 90s, and I guess it was but I understood the people who wanted to leave it pure. I knew the people, and I understood the people who wanted to hang on at all costs. And I think I was one of those hang on at all costs people, which is I don't want the music to really stop.
Right.
I don't want the experience, because to me it was the music and the experience, and I thought the experience was probably the most critical component, which also leads me to this question, which is, from the experiential point of view of all the people, let's talk about the merchandise, the clothing that you would buy, the Fat Veggie burritos, the tapes, the song books, that kind of stuff, the whole, the flea market, I don't know what you'd call it.
Shakedown Street.
Shakedown Street, exactly.
Yep.
Talk about that. What were people's reflections and thoughts about that?
Well, I met some vendors, so folks who sold on tour, and that's how they stayed on tour. Was basically in some cases making just enough money to cover their tour expenses, and in other cases, 19-year-old kids making $10,000 cash in the summer, and then going to college, the next year, and then doing it again, and then taking the money and going to their next year of college. So it really was a mixed bag. There were, from the vendor's standpoint, you definitely had some real entrepreneurs who leveraged that experience and went on to business and did very well for themselves financially. To other folks who were like, we just need to make enough to get gas and get to the next city, and that's how we're going to do it. So there was that. From a cultural standpoint, there was a little bit of a shift. Some people talking a little bit more about the commercialism and the difference between the early shows earlier years shows where you just kind of go to the later ones where it was a huge production in the parking lot scene. It was its own separate kind of Grateful Dead experience out there. I know for me personally, and this is just sort of funny, but when I was in graduate school, I guess I had for the better part of my youth, my entire wardrobe was Grateful Dead things. And but as I got older, and once I was probably a senior in high school or so, I kind of packed that away a little bit, and all of my clothes went into bins and went up into the attic, and that, I grew up into a little bit of a different style. And then when I was in grad school, I was in Europe, and my parents were selling our house. And my mom called me and said, hey, we're packing up your room. What do you want to keep? What do you want to throw away? And so we were going through the list, and she said, I've got 2 bins of Grateful Dead T-shirts. What do you want to do with these? And I was like, I think it's time. I think we can let them go. Because I hadn't even, I hadn't worn them in years. I said, I think it's time to go. And my mom couldn't throw out the tour shirts. So it was very funny. So we still have bins in my parents' house, are still bins of any of the Dead T-shirts that we bought on tour. So if there were any shirts that, I just kind of bought at like a general Grateful Dead shop, those were allowed. My mom felt, this is my mom's decision, was that those could go, because those could always be replaced. But any T-shirts that we actually bought at a concert that said the date and the tour, those couldn't go. So we held on to those as a family.
Wow.
Yeah.
We only have a minute left, so so for more information, people will go where?
Oh, for more information, people can go to www.endlesstourproject.com. I am occasionally updating it, but right now just working on the book. I'm in Utah, pulling all of this into a narrative. So I'll be posting updates on the website and on our Facebook page, which is Endless Tour Project. And that's where we are.
All right. Well, this is what I'm going to say to all those people out there listening. The great thing about this show is, even though we only have so much time right now, the bonus part, which is the part that's going to come after this, will be part of our YouTube channel. So,
yeah.
so thank you for listening. EndlessTourProject.com. Check back often to see what Joanna's up to, and we will definitely check back with her in a little bit ways down the road, because when you're part of the Grateful Dead family, you never really lose touch. So thanks for listening.
Thanks, guys.
Oh, thank you. We'll see you on the other side of this on YouTube. So I guess that's the great thing about the internet. It's sort of endless. Well, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week. This is Richard Solomon and Paul Solomon on a special YouTube continuation of our FM broadcast. As you know, we broadcast on WCWP 88.1 FM, and we had Joanna Colangelo on for a second hour of radio with us as she reflected back on the Endless Tour Project. But sometimes you have more stuff, and this is the more stuff part of the show. And what we thought we'd like to do is put this on YouTube for all of our fans out there who both love the Dead and actually want to have a little bit extra. The little bit more, this is the little bit more. So we had a great conversation. The full second hour is on YouTube, but this is like the part that will only be on YouTube. So this is for the real
special features. Right.
This is like for the diehards out there. So here you are. You've done the whole thing. What would you say was sort of the most fun thing you did, or the most bizarre on the road? And did you eat like things like, did you try like rattlesnake in Arizona? Did you hang out in the desert with Native Americans or drink moonshine in Tennessee, or any of the things that you see on cable TV? Did you meet Survivor Man? or people wrestling crocodiles in the swamp?
In my spare time? Wow, that's a good question. Because yes, I think the answer is probably a resounding yes on most of those things, but maybe not the wrestling crocodiles. Wow. I'm just trying to think of short, good examples for you. I think that this maybe isn't the best example, but it's the first one that comes to mind. And it was actually one of my last nights on the road. And I was in South Dakota, and I was in the Badlands. And I decided to camp for the night. And I was pretty far, I was not near anything for the most part. And it was very, very quiet and very dark. And now I'm a New York City kid, so I'm okay in big cities. I'm comfortable there because there's people there. But I've since moved out west and have gotten a lot more comfortable with the quiet and the sort of rolling landscapes. But there is something about being in the middle of the Badlands, South Dakota, by yourself at night in the quiet that's very relaxing and beautiful, and also a little scary. So that was, I remember setting up my tent, and I hung a little lantern, and I was just kind of reading and dozing off to sleep. And I guess I fell asleep at some point because I woke up to turn my lantern off, and I just heard, I don't know what was outside, but I heard something crawling around outside or rustling around outside. And it was like in an instant, I turned into this 3-year-old kid. And the only thing I could think to do, now mind you, I've got hunting knife next to me. I have, all the best things I could have to protect myself. And all I could do was basically get myself in a fetal position and close my eyes and think that if I couldn't see it, it couldn't see me. It was like going right back to being a child. And I have no idea what it was. I don't think it was another human because there weren't any cars anywhere near me. So it had to have been some kind of animal. It was probably like a hedgehog or something, but it sounded much bigger in my mind at 3:00 in the morning. So that's one of the mysteries. I still have no idea what that was. And I tell you, I was not trying to make a sound. I didn't want it to come anywhere closer to me than it already was.
So tell me if this mental picture is correct. You're sitting there strumming the guitar by the fire, in the middle of the desert, singing "Home on the Range," where the deer and the antelope play.
Let's see. I did. I didn't do a whole lot of strumming, but I did a bit of drumming. So I was in. Yes.
Very apropos. Very apropos.
Exactly. Yeah. And I'm one of those people who thinks I can play the guitar, but I can't really. I can play 3 chords. So when I'm with company, I try not to play the guitar and embarrass myself. But I was out in Maryland. I was on a farm in Maryland, and with a bunch of people, actually kind of around my age, and they were great. I had one of the funnest nights with them, and they had this old family farm that had been and they're passed down for 4 generations or something in rural Maryland. And so there was 5 of us, and we all sat around the kitchen with one of those iron stoves, and just kept putting the wood in, and that was kind of keeping the house warm. And they broke out the guitars, and we flipped over a plastic bucket that had been holding some grain, I think, for the horses. And we took out 2 wooden spoons. And so I put the bucket in between my knees and took the spoons as drumsticks. And we must have played for a couple of hours, and everything, from Grateful Dead to just traditional kind of Americana music. And that was a really fun night. I think I have that stuff recorded somewhere.
Oh, that'd be awesome.
That could make the bonus DVD one day, maybe.
Or the next album, Live from the Prairie.
Exactly. That was a fun night.
To what extent did people talk about other rock bands or other things like Woodstock or the Monterey Pop Festival or famous deceased musicians, Hendrix, Joplin, Kurt Cobain?
That's a good question. I don't know. Not as much as you would think, actually. I think because we were so focused on the Dead, Some people might have talked about having seen the Dead at like Watkins Glen. So people talk, interestingly enough, people talked quite a bit about the band and the Grateful Dead, that connection.
Okay.
Which is funny because I'm a huge band fan, but it's funny because on the surface, at the time, if you were to go back to 1967 and 68, you had the Grateful Dead out on the West Coast, kind of the face of the psychedelic music scene, the psychedelic Haight-Ashbury scene. And then you had the band, who was kind of looking physically the complete opposite. These mountain men up in Woodstock playing acoustic, kind of Americana, what would become accepted as Americana music. And it was almost like they were polar opposites, geographically and physically, and all of that. And as time has gone on, and as legacies get defined over time, I actually think the band and the Grateful Dead legacy is a whole lot closer. It's much more interconnected than it ever was. And I think ultimately the reason for that is when you really chip away at all the other stuff, at all the, the photography and the psychedelic lettering and all of that, when you really get down to it, and you listen to something like American Beauty or Working Men's Dead, and you listen to music from Big Pink or the Brown album, those albums are pretty similar musically. And I think that might have gotten lost in the moment, in the late 60s and the early 70s.
So what did you learn about yourself on this? And what's did you learn that you had more strength or resilience than you thought you had? Or
I will tell you the strangest thing I learned about myself, and it really surprised me, because I am not, I like to be very impromptu about things. I love to take chances. I love kind of like any sort of adrenaline sports. I really, really like the freedom that comes with all of that. And what really took me by surprise on this project was how much I missed a routine.
Oh, interesting. Mm-hmm. Oh, that's very interesting.
Very interesting.
That's very contraindicative, or whatever they say.
Oh, hugely. Yeah, hugely. I have to say that really surprised me. That was the one thing I was not expecting. But it's great. I mean, that's the whole point of doing this stuff sometimes, is just, you find out different things about yourself. And what I found really rejuvenating, was getting back on the road. So for the long hauls, any long drive, I really enjoyed that, because strangely enough, that was actually a little bit of a routine. I knew that I was leaving point A and getting to point B, and I'd be doing X, Y, and Z in between. That was a very, very eye-opening to me, how much I didn't realize, how much I actually did have a structure in my life. Never thought I did until I legitimately didn't. What did you find about America that was different from your perception of America? I don't know if I found anything different, as much as it just continued to reinforce how much I love traveling through this country. There's constant surprises. There's a constant friendliness, I think, a hospitality among strangers. And I don't just mean that in the Grateful Dead community. There's endless beauty. This trip was the fourth time I've traveled the country. I've done it by train, by bus, by car, a couple of times. And this was, I guess, maybe the second time I've done it by car. And I think, I don't know that I could pinpoint any particular surprise, because I go into any of these American trips knowing that I'll just be generally surprised by what I see. But I will say, this trip probably took me to some of the more remote places I've been. And whether it was like the deep, deep, deep south and things like that. And so I definitely, I got to see maybe some areas of real rural poverty that I hadn't seen before. And that was it was sad. It was, it's hard to see that. But again, I don't know if it was as surprising. I knew it was there, but it's very different to see with your own eyes.
Okay. If you had to do this all over again, knowing what you know now, would you do it any differently? Would the improv be different?
I think that's another very good question.
That's what we specialize in.
Yes.
Mind probe.
You saved the real tough ones for the bonus YouTube footage. I wouldn't change any of the improvisation because that was really some of the fun stuff and the freeing part of it. It was very, very liberating to be able to say, like, okay, it drove me crazy at times, but it was also very liberating and one of the only times I think in my life that I could say, all right, next week, totally different plan, not going to California, going to stay in Oregon for an extra day or swing out to Idaho or something. So that was essential, I think, for the success of the project, or at least for the journey. But if I were to do it again, I think I would maybe it would be a different approach. But I think I would want to make sure that I had at least a few weeks in between where I could go home again and just regroup and
swap out the hard drives.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that was by the end, Lord knows I'm not complaining. I had a blast. But I was really tattered, I was really, really, really just exhausted. And I looked it, it took me a while to look like a human being again. So I think if I were to do it again, I would try to build in a week here and there where I could go home and just regroup, take a rest, maybe do my laundry,
Yeah.
and then go back.
So what was the food on the road like? Did you try to eat, at the little ma and pa, places or the truck stop, things as opposed to the general fast food things that you see everywhere?
Yeah, I did. It was a mix, honestly. And it was, I have to say, when I was on really long hauls driving, I did typically go to my old standbys. Because I just didn't. A lot of times I was just on main highways, and I didn't know where there were kind of local mom and pop stores. So those were usually some of the more standard. I would just stop and get a sandwich somewhere. I tried to avoid major fast food, just because it's kind of gross when you're sitting in the car for all that time and it's just sitting in your body. So I would try, if I went to a rest stop, I would try to pick up, a banana or something and at least keep some fruit in my body. But when I was in cities or small towns, I definitely tried to eat at the local places. And when I was with people, if I was staying at people's houses I wound up staying at a lot of people's farms. There were a lot of deadheads with farms on this trip. Then I would usually always eat. If they were cooking, then that was hands down. I was going to eat their home-cooked meal.
Cool.
Yeah.
Now, how much material do you have? I mean, in terms of hours of recordings, you must have a ton of stuff.
I do. I think I did, I can tell you right now, I did 64 interviews, I believe.
Wow.
And they ranged from, some of them were 30 minutes to others were 3 hours. So I would say, at the very least, I had a couple 100 hours of footage.
Wow. How are you going to pare that down? That in itself is a monumental task. And in some ways, since you were part of it, it's like sometimes I have other people listen to my stuff to tell me how to edit it because I was so on top of it that I've lost objectivity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think I think I've resigned to the fact that maybe 25% of those interviews are actually going to get into the book. and that's fine. It would be impossible to do it otherwise. And sometimes it's just a matter of what fits. There might be some really good interviews that don't get in the book because ultimately the book, it's a narrative. It should be read like fiction. And so in some of these cases, the interviews actually just may not be the right fit for that medium. And you might see them elsewhere. It might be on a web series, or it might be in a movie, or, it might be somewhere else that you'll get some of those other interviews. So part of it is actually trying to pick out what's going to work for the story, and not bog the reader down too much. And then also just knowing, that at some point the stuff's going to have to come out somewhere. I'm just not quite sure of what the outlet is going to be, but yeah, you're right. There's so much of it. And it's interesting, from a cultural background, from an American studies type background, it's just an interesting part of the Grateful Dead phenomenon to have these stories preserved, of people telling their own memories of the Grateful Dead who were there. Well, that's not going to go on for too much longer.
Well, I definitely encourage you to think about at some point, when you're 125 to, will or bequeath this to some archive.
Yeah.
Because I do think that there's something very, very special about a treasure trove of this kind of music and thought to preserving and identifying it and analyzing it, just as kind of we did on the radio a little bit. But you really, we only scratched the surface where you have, tons and tons of stuff. How much time are you giving yourself to write everything? Is there a limit? Is there a limit, or is there a cap, or just it'll be what it'll be?
I think it's going to be what it's going to be. So I came out here to Utah. I'm in the mountains of Utah right now. In early July. So I'm giving myself July through October to write as much as I can write, without, distractions of everyday work and this, that, and the other thing. And whatever I get done in that time period, I get done. Some days I am writing page after page after page. Other days I just, you could get a paragraph out and that's all you have for that day. So it really just, you just keep chipping out at it. I do try to write every day, even if it's not a lot, because sometimes you just start writing and you think it's going to be a slow day, and then all of a sudden it turns out you've got 10 pages written that day or something. So that's kind of the plan, and then I'll go back to work, and just keep working on it.
All right. Are you an analog writer or a digital writer? In other words, are you one of those people, are you taking a shower and all of a sudden, you start writing on a pad, or are you one of those people who just kind of clears the desk, puts the computer on or a tablet or something like that? What's your writing process?
Honestly, a little bit of both. So I keep a notebook next to my bed at all times. I have definitely been known to wake up in the middle of the night and write a paragraph, and wake up in the morning and have no real recollection of it and then see it there. And sometimes it's really interesting and great, and other times it makes absolutely no sense, and that's perfect. But I do, I look at this right now as though it is my job. And so every day I get up and I sit down and I start to work and write. And sometimes it's just me sitting at a computer trying to get a few sentences out, if it's not coming. And like I said, other times I'll sit down and be like, it's just, it's a few pages without even really thinking about it. But for me, I do need a little bit of structure in what I do. And so it's very important that I wake up and treat it like, okay, I'm going to work now. I can't have those distractions, but yeah, 100%. I go out for long rides in the mountains and I keep a tape recorder next to me. And if I get a thought, I'll just take the tape recorder out and start talking, or I'll write on the back of a receipt if it's in my car or something, and then I'll come back and go back to the computer and do that. So it's a huge hodgepodge of how it comes together.
Wow. So there are obviously a lot of people who are supportive. Does anybody want to make special mention of? I know they're on your website, graphics people, legal people.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of friends and family have been supportive. both in terms of donors and then also just moral support. Like I said, people who will, take phone calls from me when I was, if I was on a 3-hour drive in the middle of the night in the, mountains of South Dakota, and I was kind of scared and wasn't quite sure where I was going. I could always call my parents, and I could always call my best friends, Nikki Tambini and Anthony Tominelli, and we would just chat and keep each other company. And that was very, very, very important, not just from an isolation standpoint, to know that no matter how far you were in this little strange environment that I had created for myself, that I still had, people who I loved very deeply and who loved me back, and were just very supportive and excited about what we're doing. Like, I never felt like as isolated as I may have been in the country, I actually never felt isolated in the project because I had a lot of people who were doing it with me, even if they might not have been sitting in the car. But they were very, very much doing it with me and had been from the very beginning. They were part of the planning process, and we'd bounce ideas off of each other. And so I couldn't have done it without parents and friends.
Oh, cool. So we'll leave it. We're going to leave it at that. You're part of our radio family and part of our YouTube family now.
Yes.
and obviously we want to check in with you in the future. So we're really not going to say goodbye. We're going to say, I guess, like the Grateful Dead, we'll just hang up and it's just like, oh yeah, we'll see you next time.
We're going to take a short break.
Yeah, we'll be right back after this short break. So I'm going to quit the recording here, but we'll continue on and we'll say like the formal goodbyes. But thank you for participating in this segment and with all the radio that you did with us. So for all those listening, from our hearts, a million thanks for being a part of the show and sharing all this great information and experiences, because in the end, that's what life is really all about. So,
absolutely.
All right. So that's it for this segment on YouTube. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you at the next time.